Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. Indeed, it is showtime. It's E-Day here in Ontario, finally. I mean, I know it was a short campaign, but, who thought that doing a daily podcast during an election campaign was a good idea? I just wonder out loud, especially given the way this one has gone. But those of you who've been here, there's new audience, so thank you for joining us throughout the last 28 and a half days or however many days we've been doing the podcast. It is the On a Ledge podcast, your Ontario politics podcast, but again, we've been doing it on a daily basis. We'll wrap things up tomorrow with the sort of sifting through the entrails of the returns and see how all of that plays out. But if you're kind of been living in a cave, welcome to Election Day and the beautiful weather we're having right across the province, apparently. So it's snowing, and it's wet snow, and it may not be hard to get around in terms of walking, but if you have mobility issues or you're trying to drive, it might be a bit of a challenge. So how will that affect things today? All right, let's get around the table. From CHTV in Hamilton, our Queen's Park commentator and a longtime contributor to On the Ledge is Keith Leslie, former mayor of the city of Toronto. John Tory is here this morning, and Tim Hudak, rounding out the table, former PC Ontario leader and partner at Council Public Affairs. I was saying just before we came on, Tim, whoever led the weather committee with the Tory campaign knocked it out of the park today.
Yeah, I'm not going to buy that. All right, I'll tell you why I'm not going to buy that. Of course, February campaign is going to be a winter. I don't know if the groundhog was right or wrong. It did warm up this week, but look, I don't think Conservatives benefit from less people getting out. Number one, those in the oldest demographic are more likely to vote Conservative. Those in the second oldest demographic, sort of 50s through mid 60s, more likely to vote Conservative. There's a whole whack of blue card carrying snowbirds vacationing in Florida. This election call was very strategic and has turned out incredibly well for the Conservatives. And Doug Ford ran an excellent campaign, and Corey Teneycke is a campaign manager. But voter suppression, I don't buy it for a bit. I think it hurts Conservatives more than anybody.
John Tory?
Yeah, I tend to think Tim is right. But I do think the turnout was always going to be low for a whole variety of reasons we can discuss. I think it might be lower still if the weather's bad, but I don't think that, anybody will be particularly disadvantaged by that. I think the people that are going to have trouble today, not because of weather, but because of motivation, might be the New Democrats. And that could be decisive, both in the context of how big the Doug Ford win is and who the official opposition is. So we'll see. I think the Conservatives will get there today. I don't think they're calling for a massive snowstorm. It's just snow, and compared to what we've had, it's relatively minor.
Keith, the question of voter turnout, though, is really the critical number that we really should be watching, because it has consistently gotten softer over the last number of years. And so the level of engagement, as much and all as we've been at it every day, regular folks around the kitchen table or at the office. I was at the rink last night, and I said, well, make sure you guys all go out to vote. And like 3 guys said, oh, yeah, it's election day tomorrow.
Well, I mean, we'll point out, low voter turnout. Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives got their last majority with 18% of eligible voters supporting. 18%. That speaks a great deal to the fact that people just aren't engaged a lot of the time. And to see them expect to be engaged in a federal provincial election in February, when we've got Donald Trump just every day flooding the zone with so many stories and angles and throwing Canada in at least 1 or 2 times a day, pretty much, that everyone's jumping on that. To everyone else's point, that feeds right into Ford and the Conservatives' election strategy of making it all about Donald Trump, forget about the healthcare issues, the education, forget about their record as a government and concentrate solely on Doug Ford. He came out with a new Captain Canada sweater yesterday. It's all the red hockey jersey, but with Never 51 across the back. He's just built for slogans, this guy. And that's, I think, fighting Donald Trump is a slogan kind of war. So he's kind of perfect for this in many ways. So I think I still think low voter turnout was a design by the Conservatives. I know Tim and John disagree on that. Because I do think, though, it will hurt all parties equally. It's going to be tough to get the vote out. Certainly in Eastern Ontario, it looks particularly nasty today. And there's some freezing rain and snow and mix everywhere else. So, it's going to affect everyone equally in that sense. But I still think it was designed by the Conservatives, knowing that they got elected with 18%, that if they can keep it low again and there's no big fumbling issue by Doug Ford, they're going to get reelected with another majority.
Well, Tim, the tariffs were such an overwhelming detail in the news cycle. That's why you don't know whether or not Wiarton Willie saw his shadow. They just swamped that news that day entirely. We have no idea. But even now, I was watching the CBC newscast last night, Adrian Arsenault. Just by the way, I think that's probably the best newscast on the air that we have in Canada. I'm just saying. And last night was just such a great coverage of the story from stem to stern, including the Ontario election, everything from how it was going to affect small business, but the uncertainty now, and we saw clips from the cabinet room yesterday in Washington, Tim. I have no idea what Donald Trump was saying, and I watched the clip 4 or 5 times, and one of his cabinet secretaries chimed in to try to clarify. Wow. There's no certainty there. We're all throwing the dates out, but we have no idea if or when at all any of this is going to happen.
I had the opportunity during the campaign to go down to Washington, D.C. as part of Premier Ford's Ontario days there to really talk to Americans and encourage Americans to talk to Americans about the importance of the trading relationship, what it means for affordability, jobs, and investment. And Dave, there were 2 really interesting takeaways from that when I spoke with Americans and decision makers, political staff. Number one, the Republicans agreed with the Canadian position. They'd say, "We're right. You're right. This seems crazy to us. We should turn our trade guns on China and strengthen our relationship and more opportunities." But we're not going to say anything. They're afraid of President Trump, his vengeance. He has momentum out of the gate. Seems to be in all directions. Who knows? So they're keeping their mouths shut for the time being. Although I think that will change. And the other part, Dave, to your point, then I'd say, well, what is the president after? Like, we're not really sure. They weren't sure exactly what the trade-offs were, if there is a vision of a grand bargain, or it's just sort of random to enjoy being in the press, being a bit of a bully, and keeping the pressure on Canada. They really didn't know what the president's end game is, or if he has one.
Well, John Tory, the idea, and again, it might sound like a leap, but this whole question or conversation around the rare minerals deal that Trump is allegedly going to strike with Ukraine kind of plays into the narrative here in Ontario, considering how rich we are in those very same kind of minerals, how important they are to our economy, et cetera. But if he's distracted by that shiny thing over in Ukraine, does that take pressure off here?
Well, all it does is it creates more uncertainty and insecurity and fear on the part of average people. Because I think if we bring it back down to average people in Ontario, and this is why Doug Ford will do well on this issue, is because all of this is so uncertain, almost on a daily basis, that people are just worried. I mean, are they going to lose their job? And so on, all that whole thing that relates to their pocketbook. And, we say over and over again, those of us who have either been in politics or who analyze it, that, elections are about leadership and pocketbook. And this is another example of that. And look, I will also say, Doug Ford they've run a great campaign. As Tim said, it was very strategically initiated, but they've also been lucky in that you'll remember that I was a little worried that when they sort of staked their ground on that issue, and then around the day the election was called, Donald Trump postponed putting on the tariffs. And you thought, oh, maybe they won't happen after all, and maybe the fear will go away. But every step along the way, including as recently as 2 days ago, he has had a different position on April the 4th and March the 4th and this day and that day. And yes, it's happening. And then there are people who vainly try in his cabinet room to say, well, no, that's not really the case. But, he speaks. I mean, he's the president. So I think this has really helped Doug Ford to keep that as the issue. And frankly, if you think about it, aside from a couple of hours of bursts here and there, no other issue has really come to the fore. And that benefits the incumbent as well.
With all of that going on, Keith, I don't know if you've seen any of the recent media that James Carville has done, the Raging Cajun, the economy stupid. He was talking about strategic patience.
Yeah, get out of the way.
Just sit back and let him burn himself out. And he actually put a date on it, saying the Trump force will only last about 30 days. I mean, I thought, holy cow. But he's actually saying, just don't get your hair on fire. And he hasn't got a lot of hair to get on fire. So he wants to be careful with that. But it was probably pretty good advice for us.
Well, good advice for all at this point, as we've now seen with the tariffs and the postponement, and I'm talking retaliatory tariffs, so they're going to be on top of it. Well, maybe they'll be on top of it. Yeah, let me think about it. But we just don't know at all what he really means. And we've seen that as we see change virtually every day. And it's part of their whole intentional disinformation, undermine trust in all authority, and just, create chaos. And we saw it this week with the Trump administration, the Financial Times floating that, Canada was going to be cut out of the Five Eyes intelligence circuit because the United States didn't want us in there separately. And then, of course, the Financial Times, this is not someone just, publishing rumors. They gave lots of people in the administration time to deny this, to say, no, that's not true. And they, of course, had to send the cabinet secretary to say, no, that's not true. But they waited until it was published, until it got online, and then they went out and denied it. So who are we to believe? Was it a trial balloon to cut us out of Five Eyes, or was it just more of this intentional chaos and disinformation that seems to serve the Trump campaign so well? And I don't know if it's always intentional. I mean, the information just changes from Trump's, the last person speaking to him and the last thing he sees in front of him. So it isn't always intentional, but it does seem the overall plan is to just, as I say, create as much chaos as possible and keep all of us off balance around the world in trying to deal with the Trump administration.
Dave, I learned during the pandemic, one lesson I learned, and I probably learned it before that, even when I was a business executive, that when there's a crisis on, people want to see you calm and steady and reassuring. And it's interesting because both Doug Ford and now I've forgotten his name, Mark Carney, who are very different people, have in their own way. Doug Ford has been feistier because he's been in an election campaign and he's just a feistier kind of person. Mark Carney, if you watched that debate the other night, was just calm. I mean, he was firm in what he said he would do, and he sounded knowledgeable, and he has experience. But I think, that's where Carville's advice probably comes in, which is to say people don't want you to respond to every statement Donald Trump makes because you couldn't possibly do it and maintain your own credibility. They just want you to be firm and steady. And I think Doug Ford has been that way during the election. He will continue to be that way because that's him. And Carney, for his part, that's who he is too. He's kind of a steady, not that fascinating a guy. Doug Ford's way more colorful than Mark Carney is.
Except when Doug Ford does it, and I wonder, John, whether or not that doesn't just feed the anxiety, because he got I don't know what we're getting from this guy 1 minute to the next.
It's
like
an election
all of us.
campaign.
I get that, but I think the people who are listening don't necessarily siphon it off the way we would. There's a level of anxiety that Keith's already talked about, and we mentioned. This just feeds it.
I think you're right, but I think he'll calm down and be the premier after he's reelected as premier and go forward. But Doug Ford is that way. I mean, if he wants to get feisty, he does, but he isn't always that way. But you're right. He's in an election campaign, so that was his issue. So he had to, talk about it in a way that caught people's attention.
I think he's reading the room correctly. I think that's what people want Canadian leaders to react to Trump. Is that stand up to the bully routine. Just say, okay, dollar for dollar, tariff for tariff. Hell, we'll turn off your lights. I mean, hopefully we don't go that far, but having him willing to stand there, I say it's the same as the booing at the hockey games. It's not really us, but it is us. When we get pissed off enough, this is the kind of reaction you get. So I think Canadians, especially that whole 51st state thing, are really, really annoyed, united, and they appreciate when they see Doug go off on that. It absolutely works for him. I think he's just read the room perfectly.
And a lot of that too, it's the visuals, right? That cut through Doug Ford in the hard hat, the shiny yellow vest, the Team Canada jerseys. Early on, he took a sign saying tariff right through a crusher at a car recycling yard. And, like John Tory, if he were mayor today, he'd be out there in Toronto getting those snow plows going, getting the sidewalks shoveled, not only keeping people on their toes to deliver, showing empathy for the public, but demonstrating action. And you can see, I know I'm a bit off topic here, but Mayor Olivia Chow been totally absent on this issue. People want to see a lead, as John said, and a visual like that of action, that speaks more than any kind of words.
Well, I'm just saying, yesterday we decided to start the draft Tim Hudak for mayor campaign. just saying.
Is that for West Lincoln? Maybe they need some change in West Lincoln.
Would you plow the sidewalks in West Lincoln?
But that visual of taking action, rolling up the sleeves, is critical. Doug Ford has nailed the provincial campaign, and there's an opportunity for the mayor or the next mayor John, to do the same.
Wow, that was subtle. But Tim, when we were talking about this yesterday, and the expectation of acting is going to have to happen, what, by Monday? I mean, we're going to have to see Doug Ford act in a freaking hurry and come up with something that doesn't just say, I'm putting $40 billion in the kitty just in case. It can't just be that.
Well, backroom reveal here. They weren't even considering, doing a platform. That was not the plan. They decided near the end of the campaign to do so, and I think signed off on it, late last week. But what was good about that is it did include a number of initiatives to push back against the Trump tariffs, a system program for manufacturers, additional funding for critical minerals, a strong commitment from Premier Ford on knocking down interprovincial trade barriers that drive up costs and hinder economic development. So I think, as you know, Dave, in the background, right, part of Premier Ford's team is already working very closely with the civil service to hit the ground running. I expect that the cabinet, the major players will stay in the same spot because they got to take action right away. But don't think it's something that happens the weekend. They've been working on it, and it's reflected in platform.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've talked a lot about, John, the size of the caucus and everything else, and the latest numbers from 338 have the seat projection around 92, but the top end still 105.
Yeah, look, I said on radio yesterday with Deb Hutton on News Talk 1010 that he should be hoping that he gets 83 seats or something and not 90, not 92. I mean, that sounds like a strange thing to say, and I'm sure all the candidates are going to try their hardest to win today, but it just becomes unmanageable in terms of those people, and we've talked about this before, and the ones that don't get included in the cabinet or some other kind of position like that get up to mischief. It just happens. It's human nature. But look, the other thing that we have to focus on is this. I mean, Tim's right. He's got to hit the ground running because this is a real live issue. But all the other issues now that he has neatly sidestepped, and everybody's let him because the main issue was the main issue, the Trump tariff thing. They all come back home to roost, including in particular some of the issues with the healthcare system. So, that's back on the table. And when the legislature sits, or even when it doesn't, they're suddenly responsible again. The good news about winning is you win. The bad news is you're then still responsible, for all the stuff, including healthcare. So I think, and I think the economy, forgetting the tariffs, the economy wasn't strong to begin with. And so I think there's just a lot of challenges, but that's why you want to be in government, because you think you can handle those better than your competitors. But I think they've got a full plate on this, and then a full plate on other stuff that they're going to have to get to very quickly.
Well, yesterday, Keith Ford was saying we're going to win all 124.
Well, be careful what you wish for. Frank McKenna went through something like that and had to appoint people to ask his government questions for question period. That's not great. To John's point about, even if you get close to 100, there's just not enough parliamentary assistant jobs and whips and other jobs that you can give everyone else a little extra bump up in pay and a little extra recognition. Even worse, if you have that many members, the government's going to have to appoint some of them, not appoint, literally force some of them to sit on the opposition side of the legislature with the opposition parties, because there's just not enough seats on the government side if you get that many members. That's a bit of a slap in the face. I mean, having to sit on the opposition benches. You didn't get a PA job, you didn't get a whip, you didn't get anything else. You might get a committee job if you're lucky, but you're sitting on the opposition benches of the legislature just because you're going to win so many seats. And again, to John Tory's point, that's just getting up to mischief, or that's not how we do it in the media. They're much more open to talking to the media.
You love it. It's just
and letting us know what's going on behind the
scenes.
The
bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Well, but it's a realistic issue. I mean, again, just to round out the numbers, the 338 has 15 and 15 for the Liberals and the New Democrats. So you would avoid that again, that's the middle of that range.
That'd be a dream scenario for both those parties, I think, quite frankly. If they could
entirely
15 seats, they'd be in heaven tonight. I mean, that means official party status, which is 12 for both of them. I'm not convinced both of them are going to come out of this with official party status tonight. It's going to be really interesting, this race for second place and official opposition status.
So maybe that's where the push-up contest comes in, Tim, between Merritt, Stiles, and Bonnie, to see who's the official opposition leader.
I was thinking through that, right? Like, how do you determine who the official opposition is going to be if there's actually a tie in the Ontario legislature?
Well, Doug appoints one of their party members as the Speaker of the House.
That's an interesting thought.
And then who would he'd rather have than the NDP as the official opposition, I guess.
Well, there you go. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, in the midst
Yeah.
of all this too, the other thing, is that if you really look at it, and I've watched a lot of campaigns, we all have, Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles have not run bad campaigns, but they just couldn't break through. It's not like they made a lot of mistakes or they went around stumbling all over the place or had terrible screw ups on tours, or as I did, I had one policy, as Tim will well remember, that didn't work too well in the context of the way it was received. And none of that has happened to them. They just have been faced with this sort of juggernaut issue, and the juggernaut progressive conservative machine and premier that rolled over them. But it wasn't, they have not run bad campaigns. They've been short and they've been, I don't think you could point to anything and say, well, that was a horrible mistake and that cost them the election at all.
I'd agree. And I think, in fact, Bonnie Crombie improved during the campaign without a doubt. Again, my hat is off to the campaign team for the Conservatives. Their strategic approach gelled well with what they did in ridings across the province and the premier. Maybe talk about old Sparky offhand or what have you, but otherwise, right, delivered his message. And here are the results. It's incredible. 3 majority governments in a row, right? That was Leslie Frost the last time that happened. But to increase your seat share, like Leslie Frost did not increase his seats in his third race. Like, this is historic.
I think it places Doug Ford, frankly, as maybe the most successful conservative politician, if you look at it, in this generation. And I dare say that, given his leadership on the national front with regard to the tariffs in Washington and so on, there'll be some chats given everything that's going on. Things have changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 months federally too. And, I think there'll be some chats about what role he might play. He's just won an election. He's going to be premier, but there are other opportunities that always lie ahead for people. So
okay, I want to get to that in a second, but here's what I want to ask you guys. Tim, if you're in the Liberal war room and you had to make a choice, do you want Bonnie to win her riding, or do you want the party to get official party status? And you can only have one.
Okay, because they kind of will likely go hand in hand. All right, so. Well, if you're in the war room, you're probably on Team Crombie. But let's say I'll rephrase it a little bit for leading Liberals. I think it's official party status. If the leader cannot get you over that hump to official party status, I think I'd question that leader's ability to get you to an election win in 4 years' time. I'd take the party status.
John,
I believe the same as Tim. And by the way, I thought it was hilarious. I really did smile because it's just one of those things where you smile and sort of say it takes some chutzpah for Doug Ford to go right into her riding. And not only that, to go to some Polish hall, because Bonnie's a Polish background, and just go there on the last day of the campaign. And Patrick Brown, the mayor of Brampton, has been sending busloads of people to help his mother-in-law, who's the Conservative candidate. The whole thing is one of the only interesting things that's come out of all this. And it'll be interesting to see what happens tonight. But I would take the party status for the same point that Tim made.
So what does that say then, Keith? If Crombie doesn't land that, you get official party status, but again, the party in and of itself kind of is still shaking from the last 2 elections. But you kind of have to go through the hoops. Interim leader, you have somebody cough up a seat, all of these things that really, drag the party down even further.
Well, it's a great time for reporters to be covering an opposition party when this happens, because normally opposition parties don't get that much attention. And as John will rightly attest, because he's been through this, we gave him a whole lot of attention when he didn't win his seat.
Attention I didn't want. Thank you.
Well, but it makes it better for all of us. It makes democracy better. But I did want to say something about Doug Ford's last day when he was in Windsor, his last day campaigning. The local candidate was asked, hey, how come you didn't participate in any debates? And this is the one area that the Ford government has taken a lot of hits on during the campaign. None of their local candidates would participate in debates, not even cabinet ministers. And Doug Ford stepped forward. He was calling the candidate up forward to speak in Windsor, and he said, oh, wait, stop. That's an unfair question. I decide that we weren't participating in debates, although he himself as leader participated in the 2 debates. But Ford basically, it's unfair of us to ask local candidates why they wouldn't participate in local all candidates debates. And he said it was his decision. And still, as I say, that was a vulnerable point for them right across the province. He stood right up. He's not worried about that hurting him in the slightest. And it probably won't. I think it should be. Come on, this not participating is a big deal, at least to me as a journalist. I mean, it's one of the first things I started covering in politics was all candidates meetings. And they were so eye-opening to see how many different types of people there could be in a riding and what their local issue. It was fascinating. And it's an important part of democracy. And you do get to see how candidates perform under sometimes it's the first real stress they've faced publicly. I think it's important, but I don't think it's going to hurt Doug Ford that he basically admitted ordering his candidates not to take part.
Well, Tim, that's a perfect storm there. It's first, there's a political strategy that makes sense. You don't want your candidate to get in trouble, and I understand that. But then there's also the state of the media. The question, and really, that amounts to earned media, and good or bad or otherwise. So there's less of that. There's less coverage of the campaign, and what we have begun to rely on. And we were talking about, the Meta spend there last week. The Liberals were spending a huge amount of money on digital advertising, etc. Let's face it, that's where the campaigns of the 21st century live, and they're fought. It's based on where you place your ads and how effective they are and who you put them in front of.
Yeah, as campaigns evolve, there are some good developments, and then there's some developments that I lament. Good developments, there's a greater ability of politicians of all parties to connect directly with voters electronically, right? There's better two-way directly to voters, and I think that's actually a healthy thing. Certainly in our lifetime, we see more and more candidates reflecting the modern face of Ontario that wasn't true even like 10 years ago. But on the negative side, yeah, I decry the loss of local debate. I remember fondly my local debates. I can tell all kinds of stories about it. It hones you as a candidate. And even though most people there may be cheering for their own home team, it still has an impact on, measuring which candidates are going to stack up as your local representative. I'll throw one quick wild card on the floor too. And I don't think Mike Schreiner's run a good campaign for Green. He's come off as harsh, and he's moved his party to the left where I don't think they're as attractive as where he stood. I'm actually going to make a Hudak prediction that he goes down in seats.
Well, he hasn't got a lot to give up. Right. John, the whole idea of putting candidates out there, though, and actually allowing them to respond one-on-one, whether it's in a town hall or a debate or however you want to look at it. To me, that I understand the political strategy around not doing that, but what it says to me generally is that you are putting candidates out there who are incapable of actually handling themselves among the electorate and answering for what they do.
I think that's unfair, Dave. I think the kind of person that normally would win a nomination and step up probably does have the ability, even if they got to the point of getting a nomination. And a lot of them have been before that a councillor locally or a trustee or something. I think it is just symptomatic of the much broader trend we've talked about, which is even when they get elected as MPPs, that, let's be frank, in a majority government or in opposition, you're basically ignored most of the time by most of the people, including the media, notwithstanding Keith talking about paying attention. But you do pay attention at the controversial moments, but not on the day-to-day, debate about the healthcare issue or whatever. And then in the government side, I mean, you really, so much control rests now in the Premier's office, whoever the Premier is. It's the same in the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, that the role of an MPP is diminished in my view. And I think that's very bad for the system overall, because there's a lot of very talented people, to the opposite of your point, a lot of very talented people with a lot of motivation, a lot of experience, and a lot of ability to stand on their 2 feet and debate and speak, who just get kind of sidelined to this kind of bit part on both sides of the house. And I think that's a symptom of the whole thing, including the failure to debate at the local level.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting for a second that they aren't capable of doing it. I'm saying they are, but the impression that because the leader steps in and says, you can't do that, to me, it says, why? Is there something wrong with what they're able to do? I just think it's a disrespect, not just of the electorate, but of the people on the team who stepped up to do what you've asked them to do.
Ford's defense is always, they're going to meet hundreds more people knocking on doors. Well, no, they're not. If you do the math, even at 3 minutes a door, they're not going to meet hundreds more people. But it's still, they won't let us cover them doing door knocking, which is something we used to do. I'm sure Tim and John, you've had reporters or columnists tag along with you when you go door knocking. Yep. And there's a bit of a risk there, because even though there's some advanced people knocking doors ahead of you, you might pick the wrong household. And
I'll tell you a story about that. When I was the leader of the PCs, we went to the house in which I was born in North Toronto. And of course, we're thinking this is all a kind of neat thing to do, to go to the house where you were born and so on. Knocked on the door. Woman comes to the door. I'm not voting for you, and all the cameras are there, and
Oh no!
it's kind of, and that that's poor staff work, and I don't mean to blame
At advance,
staff, but they should have gone and sort of determined how these people were voting. But there was no running away from the cameras being there, and the fact that someone said, "No, I'm afraid I'm not voting for you. You think you're a nice fellow, but no vote here." And so yes, you're right, and that's part of the high stakes poker of politics is the unexpected, and that happens at candidates meetings. That's what makes them interesting, as you said, Keith.
And there were, I'll reinforce John's point in two ways. There were candidates for the PCs who did debates, right? It was usually more skillful ones, more confident ones. If you're in a certain place in the party, you can actually tell the campaign, go to hell, I'm going to do one anyway. And it is not a reflection that they're not talented to get there. They need to be. It's de-risking by the campaign and focusing where the resources go. But, there's always a compromise, right? In a given riding, and John, you had like 100 plus as mayor. You may have, 5, 6, 8 debates. But we would always try to work with the other parties and say, let's pick one or two, all agree to that, and at least get on the stage and get it done for the voters and to test our own skills. I hope it goes back that way.
So we started off talking about, the weather and the effect on the get out the vote. What kind of decisions are being made, John Tory, in, again, the war rooms to say, yeah, we thought we were good here, but we really have to take these resources out of this riding today to make sure that Bonnie wins or whatever it might be. There are going to be some tough calls to be made in terms of where you put your resources today for both the NDP and the Liberals, I would think.
The parties have been polling every day, and they poll in particular in the selection of, say, 20 ridings that are either close calls or that are representative of, the sort of the whole situation. And those decisions were taken about shifting people around long before today. I mean, when I say long before, they were taken probably 5 days ago, because there's some where you just concluded we're not going to win, period, full stop, and we're not going to put any resources there. And there are others where you're going to shift resources back and forth. So those decisions have already been taken, and nothing that goes on today will really affect that, including the weather. So those decisions were taken, but they do poll every day. And then there are ones that are just too close to call, and you have to, apply your resources accordingly. And those decisions, again, were taken in the last 5 days, so that they could be on the ground today and before today, canvassing those last doors and getting out those votes today.
And to what extent are the leaders involved in those conversations?
Well, to my experience, the answer is not at all.
Right.
That's what you have a campaign machinery for, and I'm sure
Yeah.
Tim's the same. That's where you have the Corey Tenykes in the Conservative case and the people in the other parties, and they'll tell the leader. And if the leader doesn't get told, because sometimes they don't want you to, have all the news because you're supposed to focus on the campaign, they know from where they're going. They know when you're told all of a sudden you're going to, such and such a place, you're thinking, why am I going there? And it's because it's either close in a good way or close in a bad way. In other words, you're close to winning or close to losing. So they have a sense of it and they're told, but the decisions are made by the campaign machinery.
Jim?
It's the worst day of the campaign for a leader, because to be a leader or a politician, right, you're high energy, you love meeting people, and you want to make sure you leave nothing on the ice. You want to, get every single vote you can. But the last day, there's not much you can do. You've got to trust your team to execute on the get out the vote. You kind of stay out of the way. As an MPP, I would still continue to knock on doors. But as leader, I let my team execute. I would go for a mountain bike ride. That was my way of sort of relieving tension and creating positive energy. And then you wait for the results. And there was always, you'd have key ridings to watch out for. And even within those ridings, Dave, you would have particular polls that would be bellwethers at all. And you wait for those results to come in. And certainly because it was a minority situation, when I was leader, you had a win speech, you had a lose speech, and then you had a tie speech. And your goal also is to make sure you can deliver any of those three.
And that's being optimistic, not I'm stepping down speech.
Yeah, right. And that's the lose speech. You never want to deliver it, but you've got a job to do. Voters are always right on election day, so it goes. So, Keith, just in terms of some of the spots that we'll be watching, Hamilton still seems fluid. There's southwestern Ontario, parts of the Ottawa region, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of change in Toronto vis-a-vis the slide by the NDP. So, what are you sensing from what's going on in Hamilton?
Exactly as you said, I think that the NDP are slipping just a little bit. Whereas the Liberal campaign seems to have gotten better. Bonnie Crombie seems to have clicked a little bit better each day as it went on. Not that Merritt Stiles ran a bad campaign at all, as others have said in this program. She ran an absolutely fine campaign. But there's some, internal NDP issues there seems to be happening there. Hamilton Centre is going to be a real interesting riding to watch, not just because of Sarah Jama, the former NDP member who now running as an independent, and the NDP are running in there. And we had the Liberals yesterday. Bonnie Crombie picked up on a video clip and an audio clip rather of the PC candidate in Hamilton Centre, Sarah Bacher, making some sort of allegation about, if to a constituent apparently that, if you don't give me some donation money, I'm not going to move your file forward at City Hall or wherever she was working. And then they're now saying it was a joke and that, it was someone using it in vengeance and all this sort of stuff. But it's made that whole riding of Hamilton Centre just crazy to try and judge what's going to actually happen there. I remember this is the riding that the current mayor and former NDP leader Andrew Horvath held for a lot of years. Hamilton Centre should be a nice, safe NDP seat, but with Sarah Jama running as an independent and so much else going on in the riding with the other candidates, I don't know if it's a safe hold for the NDP, and that's a real crucial one for them to keep on to.
Voter turnout numbers. What's your thought on prediction, John?
I don't think it'll be significantly lower than last time, but I don't think it'll be down in that range, like well below 50. And I think that's just a function of the fact that, people have just woken up to the fact there is an election, and that was by design. It is a winter election. So I think it's going to be low. And that's most unfortunate because I think, as we discussed earlier on, it perpetuates a trend that's been going on. And this has happened federally too. And remember, it came back up when Mr. Trudeau came along the first time because he was kind of new and different. And it was a change election, which this one isn't. And so, but I think it's going to be low. And I think that's unfortunate only because it means people aren't really engaged and don't think it's worth it to go and vote, which it definitely is.
Tim?
I'm still a bit of a skeptic on whether the voter rolls are accurate. I remember knocking on doors, you'd have multiple residences in a home. So I'm not sure. There's no doubt voter turnout's down. I'm not sure it's down as much as the pure numbers would tell you. More important conclusion, change elections, as John just said, are the ones that actually have the highest voter turnout. And when Doug Ford defeated Kathleen Wynne with that landslide, it was a 57% voter turnout. That's the best we've seen in 2 decades. This is not a change election. It is a February election. So I think it will actually be lower than it was last time around. And a strong voting cohort, again, the snowbirds have to navigate a difficult process to get a mail-in ballot and get it back in time to be counted. So I will say 41%.
All right. Keith?
I hope it's much closer to 50 and 45 to 50%. But of course, it is, it's a February election. And as my two colleagues have said here, there's just no huge desire for change. Despite the fact that the Toronto Star's editorial board saying that, Ford's record is just so bad that we should vote for anybody but Ford. Isn't that the problem with the anybody but Ford moment? Because they didn't endorse one of the other parties. They said, please just vote for the Liberals, the NDP, or the Green, because that's not a vote for Ford. There's the problem. That's not going to ever defeat Doug Ford if you just say endorse any of the other opposition parties. You need to pick a party if you're going to do a newspaper endorsement like that. I thought that was kind of weak and chickening out on their side, saying, it's Ford's record is terrible. He shouldn't be reelected, but just vote for any one of the other 3 parties. Well, that's not going to do the job, is it?
Well, I all due respect, I'm not sure how much weight the Toronto Star editorial board endorsement carries anymore.
Well, at least
30 years ago, it was a big deal to see it on the front page, right? But now, I'm never. Don't get me started on the Toronto Star app. But anyway,
I was saying as much as a criticism of the media and our role in it.
Yeah.
That the endorsements are meaningless for a reason. You've just given a half endorsement.
Yeah,
don't vote for him. That's not helping.
In the coming days, I mean, the voting's already started federally for the federal leadership of the Liberal Party, John. And I can't remember a provincial election where there has been so much cross-pollination in terms of, there's a shiny thing over there that really had some significance and an effect on the campaign over here. How this finally plays out, and I mentioned this the other day, vis-a-vis the debate, the Liberal debate, leaders debate, is Ford's winning because he's fighting against Trump, period. Federally, we had the leadership hopefuls for the Liberals. My view was Chrystia Freeland was running against Trump. Carney was running against Poilievre. and Karina Gould was running against the establishment in the party. And to that end, I think they need all 4 people who are on that stage to move that forward. It's a completely different dynamic because I know we think that debate was boring, but it was substantial.
Well, it was, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see, assuming that Doug Ford is, handily reelected tonight, and we've discussed earlier on today, all the things he has to do, including Ontario's role and Ontario's other issues beyond tariffs. But it's going to be interesting to see, because I'm assuming Carney also will win the leadership of the Liberal Party and become Prime Minister. Will either be right into an election or not. But I'll be interested to see the posture that Premier Ford adopts, and I suspect it'll be one where he'll be striving very hard to be very cooperative with Prime Minister Carney, if that's the result of that. And, that just feeds back into sort of, my earlier thought that I think things have changed so dramatically on the federal scene. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why the NDP is doing so poorly, because the federal NDP is just in the tank. And that's really been unfortunate for Merritt Stiles. But I think it'll be interesting to see the relationship between Doug Ford, newly elected Premier, and Mark Carney, brand new Prime Minister, and the one at the moment with the momentum. Meaning political momentum. So I think you'll see them work very closely with each other, and that's what the people want to see anyway.
Yeah, Doug Ford's line, Tim, has always been, "I can work with anybody," and away he goes, right?
Is that your Doug Ford voice? It's a bit like Fred Flintstone.
Just the one in my head, yeah.
Yeah, he almost always uses this, "I'll work with anybody, no matter what your political stripe," right? A very similar line. So that's not only his style, but it's also absolutely necessary at this point in time, and where Ontario as the, how would I say it without no modesty here, I guess Ontario as the most important economic engine and largest population center in Canada should be in this kind of crisis. Mark Carney has performed well. I do think, though, that there is a difference between people's impressions of what Mark Carney is all about and how he'll actually perform. This is an athlete who's not yet truly been on the field. And, I remember coming back to the University of Washington in 1993, my Master of Arts degree in economics in hand, so excited to go to work for the Kim Campbell government, and working every day on the campaign trail, convinced that I'll get a job in Minister's Office of Policy Advisor because Kim Campbell was going to resurrect the Mulroney coalition and cruise to massive victory. It was time for change.
Yeah. It's a good thing you had other things to fall back on there.
Like,
but Keith, does this turnaround, and we've talked about, sort of how the polling in Ottawa is playing here in Ontario and particularly here in Toronto. The one number that struck me in the last few days was the Ipsos poll that came out and had the Liberals leading by 2. And it didn't name Carney as the leader.
Yeah.
It just said Liberal or Conservative, NDP, Green, other.
Here's what I find interesting is that the federal Conservatives under Poilievre appear to have blown a double-digit 20-point, 25 astronomical lead in the polls in less than 2 months. And provincially, Doug Ford's Conservative numbers have either held steady or gone up. Poilievre has not been a drag at all on the federal Progressive Conservatives as they run their re-election campaign. Whereas I think to the point made earlier by John, I believe that Jagmeet Singh is indeed a big drag, I think, on the provincial New Democrats in this campaign. He's not been helping them at all because there's, I think, as big a desire to see him gone from the federal scene as there was to see Justin Trudeau gone. And we see that that's how the Conservatives, did the Conservatives blow this big lead, or was it simply the fact that the Liberals got Justin Trudeau to walk out of the way finally? And they all said, well, we'll deal with the carbon tax. We won't be campaigning on that. That got enough people who had either parked their votes with Poilievre because they just wanted Trudeau gone, or they were sampling him and they're looking up and they're seeing that the alternative now, which appears to be a Carney coronation, is more palatable to them than Poilievre ever was. So as I say, I find it interesting that there's been no numbers, it hasn't affected Doug Ford's numbers provincially at all. This huge drop federally for the Conservatives, but the NDP federally, I think, are absolutely a drag on the Ontario NDP.
So I'm wondering, John, whether or not Pierre Poilievre plays the role of David Peterson in this conversation, as much as when Peterson called the early election, his numbers went from way up and lost. We've had this sort of cross-pollination again of the effect of the vote, where the Tories in Ottawa seem to be suffering, while the Tories in Ontario have not only held the numbers, they've broadened their base.
Yeah, I mean, the Conservatives, let's look at it. The Conservatives are down 4 or 5 points. They're still in the high 30s, which is, but just now the Liberals have caught up to them for the moment. But let's go back to the lessons of history that Tim talked about. I mean, I was around for that too. And Kim Campbell was tied in the polls, having come back from single digits, even worse than the NDP are doing today. And she ended up with 2 seats. Now, she had more votes than the Reform Party that had 50 seats. That's a quirk of our system. But having said that, a lot of road is left to be traveled on the federal scene. I mean, let's also remember, Mark Carney, it's a fascinating thing that can happen in our system where Mark Carney could be Prime Minister of Canada in 10 days, and he's never run for anything in his life, ever, nothing. He's never been in Parliament, never been a city councillor. He's a very accomplished business person, but political skills are a different set of skills than being a business person or a bank governor. And he did okay on the debate the other night, but it's a big test coming up. The real debate is the one that's yet to come. And it'll also just be interesting to see whether he has to call an election right away or chooses to, or whether he concocts some, arrangement to keep himself there for a little while to govern. But but the Liberals haven't collapsed entirely. At least the Conservatives haven't. They've still got high 30s, which is sometimes would be good enough to form a majority government.
So let me continue on then, Tim, with our Write Your Own Adventure novel here.
Right. I choose the dragon.
Well, right. More than one person has said to me over the last 2 months, I don't know if I want to vote Conservative in Ontario, but if he were running as the leader of the federal party, I'd vote for Doug.
And you're asking me if I think that's as a possibility?
Well, I just think there's a certain attitude out there where he has presented himself and framed himself as being the national leader and has taken up some of that oxygen.
For sure. And, he is a political phenom. It is incredible to contemplate an historic three-peat and increasing number of seats you have. I don't think I've not looked all the way back, but I think that's a first in Ontario's history. So look, I'm curious on John trying to have his own views on this too. The provincial and national parties aren't brother and sister. They're not even cousins. They're more like second cousins. And from time to time, they'll support each other. But when the food is on the table, is everybody for themselves. And they will want to win an election at all costs. So there tends to be a bit of tension between the two levels, especially when one is in government and the other one is not. And my understanding is that level of tension is actually heightened now between sort of the Poilievre Conservatives and the Doug Ford Conservatives. I think I do believe reality will be that Pierre Poilievre will be our next prime minister. I think Doug Ford will choose his own fate if he wants to go for number 4 or look for something else down the road. He's still young. What is he, 58, 59? 56?
So.
Rewind that so I don't get the premier's age wrong. I mean the age. Is he 45, 46 years old? But I think that a Conservative government nationally will not allow that to develop for Doug Ford.
John Tory?
Well, I've been alluding to this during today's broadcast, and I think it will very much depend on whether Tim's right that Pierre Poilievre wins the election. I had my own experience with this. If you lose an election, especially when it looked like it was a sure thing, nowadays I'm not sure people are as willing to give you a second chance because they just think, look, you blew it. And so,
the federal Conservatives have a track record of not doing that lately.
I know, so if that happens, if let's say Carney squeaks out some kind of a win. And look, I don't even think it's going to be a big win for the Conservatives if they get a minority, because then you ask yourself the question, who are they going to work with in Parliament? So I just think, the next few months are going to be very interesting. And I would say I'll park my view on what Doug Ford could or would do. I think he has the capability. I think given the historic success that Tim referred to do sort of anything he wants if that opportunity presents itself. And I don't think, by the way, you'll see them rushing out to take a big part in the election campaign federally. I think you'll see Doug Ford say, I got a province to run here, and I'm sort of leading the effort on the tariffs, and I'm very busy, and so forth and so on. Whereas, you've seen past elections. I worked for Premier Davis, who I've mentioned on these podcasts, and he took an active role in the federal elections, but not every premier does, who is a Conservative or a Liberal with their party. And I think Doug Ford will be very, very busy during the election, not with the election.
Yeah, and that was the way it was in the last election, Keith.
Absolutely. He told his MPPs, stay the heck out of it. It's that, that's them. We'll do our thing here. I I'm not so sure I see Doug Ford going out to take French lessons. I just don't see it happening. Although, we saw a Liberal leadership candidate before she was disqualified this week ask for an interpreter at the French debate. So maybe, being fluently bilingual is no longer going to be a barrier if you can't be fluently bilingual, being a barrier to be prime minister. But I think it still is at this point. And I think it would be hard for Doug Ford to get up to a level of French that would be passable and communicative. Yeah, it's tough. And the older we get, the tougher it is to do. As all those of us that have taken French lessons know, it's not an easy thing to do. So in all seriousness, I just don't see him doing it. I think he's going to be very busy during the federal campaign as premier. He's going to stay busy. I think this is a dream job for him. And I don't think Ottawa, living in Ottawa especially, holds a great deal of appeal to the King of Etobicoke. I think he's just very happy where he's at. He's got a heck of a lot of power. And let's face it, we all know this. Queen's Park, provincial politics affects your pocketbook so much more than federal government does, that it's something he can work with. It's just his comfort area where he can go and say, I'm never going to raise a tax, I'm going to save you money. He can look at things and make things happen provincially that would be just layers of layers more difficult to do on the federal scene.
Well, you'll be on covering things at CH tonight, Keith?
Yes, I will. Yep.
And John, you and Tim are putting your 2 cents worth in at CTV tonight?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. And thanks, Dave, for all the work you've done. I think this on Ledge every day, it's a huge effort, and I think it really paid off as fantastic content. Thanks for having us as part of it.
Well, and it's just been, you're judged by the company you keep. So thank you guys for doing this, and everybody else.
You're in trouble then.
This one's never going to make the air.
Yeah. This is behind the paywall. You're going to have to pay to find the secret. All right, guys, thanks a lot, and have fun tonight. And we'll all chat in the coming days in terms of the fallout here. Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, John Tory. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, the Election Day issue. And if you were thinking, I might catch this on the radio tomorrow, and we're not going to broadcast this on the radio because all the returns will be in and all the numbers will be there, and that will be the course of conversation. So I'll be joining John Moore tomorrow as part of his coverage of the show. I know John Tory will be in there. I'm told that John might be the first one in the studio because John Moore is going to be called upon to do TV late tonight. So it'll be a full court press by everybody involved, and we'll have a wrap on the results tomorrow on the Ledge, and be glad to have your input. And if you want to have a thought on what's in the show, you can go to my website, davetrafford.com. We've got the talkback message button there. Leave me a message, all kinds of thoughtful comments on the YouTube channel, and I'm answering them as you do leave them. So thank you for doing that. But if you want to include your comments, we're happy to do that as well in upcoming programs. All right. That will do it for us. If you do nothing else today, make sure you get out and vote and watch the returns. Be active. And thanks for joining us on the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.